Hello, great to be with you virtually. I'm here to talk about designing for deeper learning, mastery, identity, and creativity, and a new grammar of schooling. So I want to start with this image. This is what we think of in schools today. Might be a little different in Latvia, but I think that the general ideas are the same. So English, math, science, social studies, PE, judging by attendance. But what if school could be like this? Problem solver, communicator, collaborator, self-directed lifelong learner, creative and critical thinker, entrepreneur, contributing global citizen. Now, I would venture to say that most of us, if we're thinking about our own children, we're thinking more about the second. Those are the set of skills, dispositions that we would like to have in our kids when they grow up. But even though that's what we're actually valuing, we're often acting as if we value the first. And so my question is, how could we change schools so that they would actually be organized in ways that support the things that we value? All right. So this comes out of research that my colleague Sarah Fine and I did over the last 6 or 7 years. We published a book, In Search of Deeper Learning, which described our visits to 30 American high schools and what we saw there. I've also done a lot of work through professional education with educators from around the world, and so I have some sense that what we saw in the United States was not that different in key respects from things that exist in other countries. All right, so I'm going to start. We spent a lot of time in classrooms, and while a lot of what we saw was fairly disappointing, rote tasks that were at the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy, we did see some really good experiences in school. And what I want to do now is I'm going to give you 3 of those experiences. And I'm just going to describe them. And as I talk, I'd like you to think about what you see as common across those 3 experiences. Okay. So the first one is a theater experience. When Sarah and I visited schools, we found a lot of dead time and a lot of bored and disengaged students in the regular classes, but we found a lot of engaged, interested, passionate, and knowledgeable students in what the United States is the extracurricular spheres, whether this happens in school or not, but arts, sports, newspaper, and other type spaces. And so we picked one of these spaces to analyze a theater production. And so the first thing that was really noticeable about this theater production, this is with high school kids, was that there was an authentic purpose. Everyone knew why they were there, what they were doing, and what the purpose was. Parents and friends were going to be in attendance in 8 weeks, which gave a lot of momentum to the day's work. No one ever asked, is this going to be on the test? It was clear that the real test was coming in 8 weeks, and the question was, how prepared would they be for that work? A second difference was student agency. So in their classes, students were basically expected to follow the directions of the teachers, and this really ran against their instincts as adolescents to become more adult, to take more responsibility. But in theater, they had a lot of opportunity to take leadership roles, particularly the older students. The older students did a lot of mentoring of the younger students, both with respect to the actors, but also the people who hung the lights or did the costumes or the set. There was just a lot of apprenticeship learning and a lot of student leadership. Third point was choice. Students had chosen to be there. They hadn't been conscripted. They had found something that they were passionate about and were getting to spend some time on that. And as I was doing this research, as I've been doing my own university level teaching, I've really discovered the importance of choice in my own teaching. So like if I'm teaching a class on learning, I might, instead of a few years ago, I might have taken an example in biology and gone through it in a lot of detail. And now I might set up 3 stations, one in biology, one in math, and one in history, and ask students to work on roughly the same concepts in these different places. And students, by the virtue of having able to choose the subject they're interested in have been a lot more engaged. Fourth point is the sort of affective, relational nature of the space. Students said that it was like a community, like a family. Some said they didn't even really like theater that much. They just liked to have a place to go after school where they were known and felt like they belonged. And so this sort of sense of community was really different from what we saw in many classes. And then the fifth point is from my colleague David Perkins at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. It's called The Whole Game at the Junior Level. And Dave's point is that if you take a sport like, say, soccer, what you all might call football, you don't spend a year learning to kick and a year learning the positions on the field and a year learning how to play goalie, and then say, when you get to graduate school, you'll get to play a game of soccer. You have little kids playing soccer as best they can from ages 5, 6, or 7, and it's not always pretty, but at least they have a sense of the whole game and how the game fits together. And as they practice the parts, sure, you got to practice your penalty kicks or kicking with the inside of your foot or whatever it might be, but you do that in the context of understanding the whole. And once we saw this, we came to think that schools had a lot of parts, a lot of practice these skills because it will be useful for you later somewhere down the road, but not so many wholes. Okay, so we did this deep dive into these extracurricular spaces, and then people said, yeah, that's great, but could you do these things in the regular part of the school and the regular part of the day? And the answer was you could. These were just sort of the exceptions to the rule. So, for example, there was a methods of scientific inquiry class, and science was a domain where we really felt like on the whole, what students were being asked to do really differed greatly from what practicing scientists did, that students spent a lot of time learning Newton's laws or what Darwin had said about the Galapagos or whatever it was, but they didn't spend hardly any time investigating what was unknown. And scientists don't spend a lot of time replicating what is known. They spend all their time exploring the unknown. And so this science class really built on that, and they designed an experiment around an authentic research question, and students got to pick the question. And so an example of a question might be something like, does music make you more focused while you are studying? And you could imagine the answer being yes, you could imagine the answer being no, you could imagine the answer being it depends on what kind of music you're listening to. The answer could be for some people yes and other people no, who differ on certain characteristics. It's not an earth-shaking question, but it's a real question where the answer isn't obvious in advance. So students picked a question they were interested in, they were taught how to conduct a literature review, and then they designed a study given the sort of financial and logistical constraints, and then they had to write it up and adjust hypotheses as needed based on what they had learned. And so this was in a school where just a regular public school, and students said, this is the first time I was really exposed to science. And then let me give you a third example. This is a project-based example from a project-based school in California, the Exonerate Project with the California Innocence Project. The California Innocence Project is a legal group that takes on appeals from death row inmates. We have capital punishment in the United States. And the problem is that there are many more people who are appealing, seeking the services of the California Innocence Project than there are lawyers who can read through all of these appeals. So what happened was they trained the students to read the letters and to look for what might be an actual appealable issues. And after this training, they read the letters and they made recommendations to the lawyers about which cases should be taken up, and then in the end they had to write an essay about the nature of the American justice system. Fortunately, the lawyers also read the letters in the end, but the students got to sort of prioritize and make arguments for which cases should be taken up. And a girl who was part of this project said, "Why do I feel like I need to do well in this project? Because we're just part of something so big. It's like we're holding somebody's life in our hands." You can see that school can be a place where people do powerful, deep, enduring, life-changing kind of learning. It's just very rare that it's actually organized that way. Okay, so what is common across these three cases? I'm just going to pause for a sec and give you a chance to think. Maybe scribble some notes. Okay. So there are a lot of things, and I'm sure you've pulled out some things that are different in some ways than what I have, but I'm going to pull out some things that we saw as important. The first one is apprenticeship learning. So you can see this clearly in the theater example. You can see it with the practicing lawyer. But the student is the doer, but there's someone looking over their shoulder. Might be an older student, might be an adult, might be a lawyer. Kind of showing them the way to go. And I think this is an interesting third position in the debates over learning, that often on the one hand you have a very sort of traditional approach to learning where the teacher talks and the student takes notes and it's very adult directed, and at the other end of the extreme you have very constructivist modes of learning where you start with the student's questions and the students spend a lot of time kind of exploring on their own. An apprenticeship kind of offers a third position here, saying you, the student, are the doer, the maker, the creator, but there are people who have more experience in this domain, and they're going to give you advice, feedback, coaching as you go. And in all three of these examples, it works like this. I teach in a graduate school. I feel like when I'm teaching students how to write an academic paper, or especially if we're working on a paper together, they're really getting sort of full-throated everything that I know about this thing because we're working on it together. A second point is the pace. So we treat school as if there is this, we're in some sort of race to get from point A to point B. In the U.S. schools, we saw, the Crusades got a week and the Cold War got 2 days. Think about that. The kind of defining event of the second half of the 20th century covered in 2 days. And what was different about these spaces was the teachers really slowed down. So one production over 8 weeks, that felt, more than fast enough. The director, in fact, said it would have been better if it wasn't a 3-act play, or it was just 2 acts or 1 act. So we needed more time to work on less. In the science class, they spent the whole semester on the one project, and through that they taught a lot of things like, how to do the statistics associated with the projects, how to conduct a literature review, and so forth. But the pace was very different than what we often see in schools. So I would really recommend that you slow down. And then the third, we came to think that what we might think of as sort of whole game teachers or deeper teachers had a different stance towards their work. So on the left, you see the way that most of the teachers that we studied were oriented, which was, the goal is to cover the material. And so the pedagogical priorities are breadth, to sort of go over all these things. The view of knowledge is certain, things that have been previously discovered by, great figures from the past. The student's role is to receive. There's a lot of talk, I don't know if this is true in Latvia, in the United States there's a lot of talk about the importance of failure, and you only learn through making mistakes, and you should try things, and making mistakes is okay because that leads to learning. And so those were on the walls. Those were the messages on the posters on the walls. But the message in the water was like, you better get a 98 if you want to go to a good college. And I think if students are essentially assimilating knowledge discovered by previous generations, there's not really any reason to valorize failure. And the ethos was compliance. In the whole game teachers, it was very different. The goal was to inspire students to become a member of the field. So could you become an actor, a scientist, a lawyer, a public defender? They were trying to give students a kind of an identity of what it meant to do the kind of work. And the content was a way of developing that identity, but the identity they hoped would hold over a much longer period of time. And so when they did that, then the pedagogical priorities became more about depth than about breadth. And now the view of knowledge really is uncertain. Like, does music help you when you're studying? I don't know. You don't know. We'd have to really find out. How should we put on this play? Which cases should be taken up? There were sort of real, genuine questions that were uncertain that students were trying to take up. And so then the student is the creator, and now failure really is important, like you can't, there's no way to land a polished performance without venturing a first version of the way you might portray a character. There's no way to do an experiment without trying a version of the experiment and so forth. And so any of us who've done any kind of professional work know that until you actually try to do something, you haven't actually even really started. And thus, failure is just an inevitable part of the learning process. And then these spaces, they felt different. They were about purpose, but play. So a lot of sort of trying things out and a kind of playful atmosphere pervaded in these spaces. All right. We came to think that three virtues were kind of particularly important as we thought about this: mastery, identity, and creativity. So mastery is what we normally think about as what school's about, developing knowledge and skill in a domain. But there are these other parts too. Identity, do you sort of see yourself as the kind of person who does this kind of work? And then creativity, are you not just taking in knowledge, but are you making knowledge? Are you doing something? And in all these examples, you could see that there was a kind of sweet spot where students were developing significant knowledge and skill, but they were doing so in ways that nurtured their identities and enabled them to be creative. And then as we came to think about this in the longer run, like if you think about something that you yourself are particularly knowledgeable or skilled in. So it might be gardening, cooking, politics, teaching, writing, whatever it is. And you sort of, let's say I asked you, like, how did you get good at that thing? And so chances are there was some sort of spark, something that got you interested in it at the beginning. And then you started to do it. So let's take, cooking as an example. You started to do it, and then you started to come to think of yourself as someone who did it. So you're no longer just like someone who cooks or putting food on the table, but like you're a cook. And then you started to make meals, and those meals started to become more complex. And then maybe you had a dinner party, and some people came over, and you tried something, and it kind of fell flat. And then you were like, need to really go back to the basics. And then you watched some videos, or you asked, your grandmother for some tips. And, this just kind of goes on in this cycle of developing more and more sophisticated versions of the work. And we think it sort of cycles through these three parts of mastery, identity, and creativity. Okay. So if we've all experienced these things and these things are good, why don't we do these things more of the time? And I think part of the answer is that there's a certain set of assumptions that we have about school which hold into place a lot of the kind of problematic work that we see in most normal classes. And so in this circle, you can see I've put kind of 5 elements of those things. And so I'm going to start in the red, the control key to learning. I'm going to move clockwise around this diagram. So I think it really starts with the most basic assumptions, which are really about control, that we can't teach students unless we can control them. And a lot of aspects of schools are really organized around, I don't know if you have these in Lafayette, but in the United States we have a bathroom pass. You can't go to the bathroom without the permission of the teacher, and they have to give you a pass. If you think of the theater example, they didn't have anything like that. Like kids, when they wasn't their scene or their turn to go, they sat in the audience, they ate, they, talked with their friends outside, they went to the bathroom as needed, and then when it was their turn to work, they really showed up and worked. And so there was sort of a sense that the production was controlling the action, and we didn't need to control every minute of students' time if we wanted them to learn. So it really starts with control. And then the second assumption is that coverage is king. So like we need to move through these dynasties or whatever it is, and we need to sort of get to the end of the textbook or the unit in the right amount of time. A third is that we should center dominant culture. In the United States, as you probably have seen in the news, there are big fights over whose culture or whose vision of United States history gets presented. So there's this idea that there's just sort of like a dominant narrative out there, and students should learn it. A fourth point is basics before deeper learning, and I think this is a really important point. In a lot of schools, we went and we said to the teachers, are you going to do deeper learning that asks students to really think and conceptualize? And they said later, like first they need to learn the basics, and then they can do the deeper things. And then we would come back the next day and the next day and the next day and the next day. And it was a little like waiting for Godot, the deeper learning day never really came. And I think that's because people have a very sequential view of, you have to learn one thing and then you can learn another. And there's some truth to this view. You're not going to, create a symphony until you've learned your scales. But at the same time, there are the best teachers we saw kind of moved back and forth between significant tasks and the whole game and teaching the basics. So if we think back to the soccer or football example, you work on the basics, but you do it in the context of doing the whole. You learn what it means to create a t-test in statistics, but you do that in the context of doing an experiment that you're designing. You learn how to modulate your voice a particular way, but you do that in the context of putting on a play. So basics before deeper learning versus basics through deeper learning. And then the last piece is sort of performance over learning. In a lot of schools we visited, there was a lot of emphasis on marks, grades, showing that you had demonstrated what the teacher had wanted, as opposed to like really exploring the underlying domain. And so we could imagine a different set of assumptions where empowerment was the key to learning, where depth proceeded over breadth, where we learned basics through deeper learning, where we centered the non-dominant cultures, the less known perspectives. I've spent a lot of time in British Columbia, where they've done a lot of work around their First Nations or Indigenous people, and they've basically said, like, Indigenous modes of learning and Indigenous knowledge is something that all of our students should have. And so in doing that, they not only made the Indigenous students feel more comfortable, like they had a real place in the school, but they also kind of signaled to the whole that these are things that everybody should know. So they centered non-dominant knowledge. And in the theater example, the science example, and the project-based learning example, the goal wasn't to get an A on the test. The goal was to discover whether music makes you better at studying, or which people in prison were worthy of California Innocence Project's time to do an appeal, and so forth. More structurally, I think part of it goes back to what David Tyack and Larry Cuban called the grammar of schooling. So they said these are the sort of aspects of schools that are so basic that we don't think of them as things that could be changed, but actually they're human creations which could be revised. And so on their list they put, as part of the grammar of schooling, age-graded schooling. So the idea that there's, first grade and second grade and third grade, and that kids of all the same ages should be together. that's just a kind of assumption that we've decided. It doesn't have to be that way. And Montessori, if your kids have ever experienced something like that, they have multi-aged groupings. Second is egg crate classrooms, the idea that there should be a teacher for every 20 to 25 kids, and that those teachers should stay with those kids. That doesn't have to be the case. You could have 50 kids, and if you were given a lecture, 40 of them could listen to a lecture, and the second teacher could hold a seminar with 10 of them. Or there are a lot more possibilities of how we could mix students and adults than what we do. We silo subjects. We sort of say, like, it's math, science, English, history. A lot of the interesting questions in the world are at the intersections of those subjects, and so we could choose to teach things that way, but we don't. Leveling and tracking. So we judge students by their perceived abilities, and then we slot them into homogeneous classes with other students who are at that perceived ability, which generations of researchers have suggested is not a good idea, particularly for the kids in the bottom levels and tracks. That's another choice. And as I've emphasized, we emphasize kind of performance over learning. So to close, and I'm looking forward to, we're going to get a chance to have a discussion later today, and I'm really excited about that. We might move towards a new and different grammar of schooling, and this draws on some of the best things that I've seen across schools. And so we could change the purpose rather than making the student sort of the recipient of knowledge. We could foreground purpose, agency, choice, and voice. So I think, like, just that one thing, if we design schools around trying to give students authentic purposes, giving them agency and choice over what they studied, and some ability to shape that over time, really everything else might follow from that. We could change the relationships. Every student should be seen, known, and heard. In all of the best spaces we saw that students thought were the best spaces, there was a sense that they had a relationship with the teacher and that they were part of a community. We could change the curriculum. There's a concept from this Japanese cleaning expert, Marie Kondo, that you should remove everything from your house that doesn't give you joy. And I think we could do the same with the curriculum. Curriculums get overstuffed over time, and so we really want to Marie Kondo the curriculum. We could change the time in the schedule. In high schools in the United States, students take 7 subjects at about 50 minutes each. Some schools move to having students study 3 or 4 subjects at a time, which enables them to spend more time on those things, to really focus on them, to do them in more depth. It also means that teachers are responsible for supporting many fewer students. So rather than supporting 150 students, they would support 60 to 75 students at a time, which enables them to build those relationships. We need to change the assessments. In the US, we're very obsessed with standardized tests, and it's pretty clear that most worthwhile tasks need to be judged through some sort of performance assessment that is pretty closely associated with those tasks. We need to change the boundaries. I think in a lot of ways, we suck all the life out of learning when we send people into schools, and we send these, little creatures who are very interested in these subjects, or who are very interested in the world. If you look at a 1 or a 2 or 3-year-old, and then we put them into school, and we wonder why they're not interested, when there are so many connections between what's happening in the world and what students are already interested in, and what could be happening in schools. And then we need to change the power relationships and center non-dominant knowledge and non-dominant perspectives for everyone. All right. So that is a kind of rough sense of some of what I've seen in schools and some of what I hope we might change. And I'm really looking forward to discussing this more with you later today. Thanks very much.